Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and I'm here with my good friend, the host of Around the World with Dee and Friends, Dee Pierce.
Yes, good to be here.
Thank you, Dee. How are you tonight?
I'm doing fine. And how are you doing, Joe?
I'm also doing fine. I guess there's a little bit of good news in the world, so we have some tonight, at least from my point of view. Okay, it's good news. Uh,
Yeah, I felt the same.
not from everybody's point of view, of course. Uh, I was watching a video from, the Midas Touch. One of the lawyers there was ranting and raving about what Trump was doing, okay, in Ukraine. Called him a coward, went off the deep end about it. So, and here's the Earl of Lurie who says, "Hi, everyone. Thank you, Earl.
Yeah, hello, Earl. How you doing?
Nice to see you. Let's start off by sharing this, okay?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm sharing out to everybody. Let everybody know we're here.
Okay, thank you. I will do that too on Facebook.
Mm. Yeah, sharing is caring.
I agree. And caring
Everybody.
is sharing.
Yes, it is. Let everybody know we're live. We are live, everybody. Come join. Join us.
Okay, so the title of this one is Change in Ukraine Policy. That's the only topic we'll be talking about here tonight. And we're going to start off with a piece from Larry Johnson at Sonar 21. Pretty good piece, not very long. So the headline is Trump tells Ukraine and NATO, "You're fired." It's dated the 12th of February, 2025, by Larry C. Johnson. He got a lot of comments on this one, 320 comments. Talk about a quick Trump pivot less than 24 hours after his disastrous press conference with Jordan's King Abdullah. Trump was back on top, getting accolades and taking a victory lap. He chatted with Vladimir Putin for 90 minutes. This was not their first conversation in the last week, but it was the most consequential one. First, take a look at the Russian readout of
Hmm.
Putin Trump phone calls. Quote, the heads of state discussed issues related to the exchange of citizens of Russia and the United States. President of the United States assured that the American side will fulfill everything in agreements that were reached. The settlement in Ukraine was also discussed. Donald Trump called for the speedy suspension of hostilities and the solution of the problem by peaceful means. It says peaceful funds here, but I think peaceful means is intended. But Vladimir Putin, for his part, mentioned uh, the need to get to the root causes of the conflict and agreed with Donald Trump that a long term settlement can be achieved through peace negotiations. President of Russia also supported one of the main theses of the head of the U.S. state that it is time for our countries to work together. Well, that's certainly hopeful that they would say that to each other. During the conversation, the topics of the Middle East settlement were touched upon, Iran's nuclear program, as well as bilateral Russian American relations in the field of economy. It doesn't say so here, But what Trump probably got from Putin was assurances uh, uh, that Iran uh, has not produced a nuclear weapon yet, and that in the recent agreement between Iran and Russia, there were assurances there, okay, that Iran would not proceed with a nuclear weapon. So I'm sure Putin said that to President Trump. The president of Russia invited the president of the United States to visit Moscow and expressed a readiness to accept in Russia American officials in those areas of work that are of mutual interest, including the topic of a Ukrainian settlement. Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump agreed to continue but personal contacts with a number, of personal meetings. Here is Donald Trump's account of the conversation. And quote, this was from a tweet, Donald J. Trump at Real Donald Trump. I just had a lengthy and highly productive phone call with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. We discussed Ukraine, the Middle East, energy, artificial intelligence, the power of the dollar, and various other subjects. We both reflected on the great history of our nations and the fact that we fought so successfully together in World War II, remembering that Russia lost tens of millions of people, and we likewise lost so many. Of course, it must be said that we did not lose anywhere near the number of people Russia lost. It should always be remembered that Russia lost 27 million people in the Second World War, and we lost about, if my memory serves me, something like 440,000. So that is a huge difference. It was Russia who bore the human burden, of World War II. We each talked about the strengths of our respective nations and the great benefit that we will someday have in working together. I think that's a very hopeful line myself. But first, as we both agreed, we want to stop the millions of deaths taking place in the war with Russia-Ukraine. President Putin even used my very strong campaign motto of, quote, common sense, unquote. That campaign motto reminded me of a little pamphlet written by Thomas Paine during the Revolution in the United States. The name of it, of course, was Common Sense. And it was a plea for resistance against tyranny. So I find it ironic that that was a campaign motto of common sense. That campaign motto was used by Donald Trump. Going on now, we both believe very strongly in it. We agree to work together very closely, including visiting each other's nations. We have also agreed to have our respective teams start to negotiate immediately, and we will begin by calling President Zelensky of Ukraine to inform him of the conversation, something which I will be doing right now. I have asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Director of the CIA John Ratcliffe, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz and Ambassador and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to lead the negotiations, which I feel strongly will be successful. Millions of people have died in a war that would not have happened if I were president, but it did happen, so it must end. No more lives should be lost. I want to thank President Putin for his time and effort with respect to this call and for the release yesterday of Mark Fogel, a wonderful man that I personally greeted last night at the White House. I believe this effort will lead to a successful conclusion, hopefully soon. And it's dated February 12th, 2025 at 11:53 a.m. And Larry says, notice whose name is missing from the list of the negotiators for the U.S. That is General Keith Kellogg. Kellogg was slated to present Trump's peace plan for Ukraine next week at the Munich conference. It appears that Kellogg's services are no longer required. I personally think that's a very good idea. He was such a silly man. He may have been pushed out because of news this week that his daughter heads up an NGO charitable organization that, in addition to other tasks, transported wounded this refers to mercenaries fighting for Ukraine from the battlefield. Larry says, I wonder if her group is a CIA front or something profiting from U.S. aid. Perhaps we'll find out in the coming days. As a consequence of his talks with Putin, Trump used Secretary of Defense Hegseth to deliver some really bad news to Ukraine and to NATO. Hegseth said in his speech to the NATO Defense Ministerial meeting in Brussels, and he made the following points. We want, like you, this is a quote, we want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Okay, that is to say, returning to a Ukraine with Crimea is an unrealistic objective. Okay, I clarified that first paragraph that way. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. Okay. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. Before I go on with the statement, okay, I want to point out that to the Russians who were looking on, okay, at this, the idea that the West is giving up any thought of Crimea going back to Ukraine, I'm sure that news, that specific news, okay, was very welcome to the Russians. And of course, I'm sure they agreed with the statement that to talk about that would only prolong the war and cause more suffering. As for the statement that a durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not start again, I'm sure that general idea was pretty welcome to the Russians because they're looking for a general European security framework the content and details of the security guarantees would be of primary importance to them. The bold statement this must not be Minsk 3.0 was certainly welcome for Russians to hear or to see, because Minsk 1.0 and 2.0 were fiascos which the West never intended but to implement. And to say there would not be a Minsk 3.0 is to say we in the United States are not going down the Minsk kind of path. We're looking for an agreement that will be implemented by both sides. That's the implication of that sentence. Then Hegseth said, that said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Now, that was one of three major goals, of the Russian SMO, of the military operation. There were three major goals of the operation. The first was no NATO membership for Ukraine, ever. Second, of course, was denazification of Ukraine. That didn't come into Hegseth's statement. And the third was neutralization of Ukraine. And that's not there in his statement as well. He went on to say, instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and also non-European troops. And I don't think that statement, there's the detail of the European and non-European troops, and the further detail, if these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a mission that is non-NATO, and they should not be covered by Article 5. Saying that was as far as it goes, was probably welcome to Russia, but the very idea of having peacekeepers and having the peacekeepers being a part of mission, that is not welcome to Russia. They will not accept any peacekeepers in the context of Ukraine except for themselves. They've made it clear, no frozen conflict and no supervision by international forces. Hegseth's next statement, there must also be robust international oversight of the line of contact. Putin will not agree to that. Going further, to be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. That, of course, is very welcome from the standpoint of the Russians. Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. I think the first of these sentences probably was welcomed by the Russians. But the second of the two sentences that Europe has to provide the overwhelming share of lethal aid, okay, to Ukraine was probably not welcome, because I think the Russians are looking for the demilitarization of Ukraine, as I said before, okay, and the denazification of Ukraine, and the neutralization of Ukraine. They're looking for all those things. So I'm sure they don't want any kind of lethal aid going to Ukraine, okay, from Europe. And I suspect they will insist on that when it comes to negotiating an overall European security framework. Anyway, that's the end of that quote. Larry comments on it. He says, to review, no NATO membership for Ukraine and Europe, not NATO nor the US, must take the lead in providing for Ukraine's security. I'm not sure I agree with that interpretation of it. I think Russia would probably want to provide a joint guarantee of the security, okay, of Ukraine within the context of the larger European security framework that it's looking for. Anyway, number 3, any deployment of European troops to Ukraine will not be covered by Article 5 and will not be considered a NATO operation. No U.S. troops on the ground. Number 4. And 5, the Europeans must take the lead in supplying lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Larry correctly says this went over like a joke about a plane crash at a funeral for someone who died in a plane crash, i.e. not well received. If you've been following remarks in the preceding months by Putin, Lavrov, Ryabkov, and other Russian leaders, the points made by Hegseth are consistent with Russian demands. While many in the U.S. believe that Putin has backed down and that Trump is in control, the reality is otherwise. Russia is not going to concede any territory, and Russia is not going to accept a ceasefire. Putin and his negotiators are focused on the root causes, i.e. NATO expansion and Western subversion, and securing a long-term security agreement. I completely agree with that. NATO got a Trump gut punch today. Their worst nightmares were realized, i.e. Trump will cut a deal with Putin and Europe will be on the sideline. As for Zelensky and Ukraine, the Biden promise, as long as it takes, is moot. The party is over. No more billions of U.S. tax dollars flowing to Kyiv. Larry then says, I had back-to-back podcasts today. Started at 10 a.m. with Nima. At noon with Anya Kay. 2 p.m. with Garland Nixon. And then a special session with Danny Davis, producer Gary. I'll post my chat with Garland tomorrow. I think it is safe to say that today marked the end of the war in the start of the end of the war, okay, in Ukraine. I think that's a pretty good guess on Larry's part. Okay, I kind of agree with it. Okay, and Larry has a number of videos here to click on. His own video on what Secretary Hegseth revealed in Brussels, okay, and what Trump and Putin may have said to each other behind closed doors. And then he has a link to his video with Nima Alkershid at Dialogue Works. And his video, okay, with Anya Kay. Very, very serious Anya Kay. And so one can click on all those to see 3 videos related to this. I'm sure they're all very good. Let's take a look at your comments. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, Earl. Friar Steve says, we know Trump took influence from Mariam Adelson, and he's probably taken something from the Russian. He is the most corrupt president in U.S. history.
I don't think so. He's corrupt, but I wouldn't say he's the most.
Well, I don't know. I'd say he's the most. There have been some, pretty corrupt ones, in U.S. history. But I don't know.
You don't know, but it's hard to just generalize like that.
Hard to generalize because there have been some extremely corrupt ones. Okay, let's say, I suppose one would argue over whether Biden or Trump, was more corrupt. For me, it's not a close call. I think Trump is the more corrupt of the two. I think he's the most corrupt one but since the 19th century. Friar Steve says Trump wants to annex Greenland. That makes no sense. Trump does not have common sense.
The whole thing is ridiculous, but I think they're looking at it. I mean, I wouldn't say he came up with it. I'm sure somebody else did, but they're looking at it, with the trade wars. Trade, you have BRICS nations and you have with the U.S. and
Right, and they're looking at it from the point of view also of shaking things up.
yeah.
They want more control over the Arctic Circle stuff. And, the statement that they're going up, to annex Greenland, can be interpreted as an opening bid in getting more control.
Yeah.
Friar Steve says Putin owns a U.S. president. That's absolutely despicable. I frankly think, Friar Steve, that is silly. I don't think anybody owns Donald Trump in that sense. I think what Donald Trump wants here is a peace agreement because he doesn't want to have a nuclear war. I mean, that's not good for his fortune. And it's not good for his family. I would agree that he doesn't have the well-being of the United States in mind when he deals with Putin. But in relation to nuclear war, the well-being of the United States and his own well-being may be the same thing. So we may be fortunate there. Robert Copeland says, the problem I have against Nima is I find he only has people on his show that he agrees with. Well, that's true of, generally speaking, of, Judge Napolitano also. He puts people on his show that know something about kinds of issues he's interested in. And the questions he asks of them are designed to elicit points of view that are, roughly in agreement with his own, but that are perhaps more knowledgeable and more sophisticated in that respect. I think we're all free to design our shows, in a particular way. There are plenty of people, who do not agree with Nima, and not, really that many people, who do agree with him. So the question arises, why should he give the platform, and why should he give space to people who do not agree with him? Since the people who do not agree with him are all over the web all the time, every day. Okay, and also on the major networks. I mean, he's an alternative network guy. So let's move on. The second piece we want to go over tonight is a video. It's a video of Colonel Danny Davis.
Question of what to do about Ukraine.
I'm sorry. Okay. Who is interviewing by Colonel McGregor, Douglas McGregor. Okay, on Danny Davis's show. His show is called The Deep Dive. So it's the Deep Dive show. And Danny will start off the video. We will go through it, and we will stop from time to time to comment. Okay, and I hope you'll comment on this too. And if you want to comment, just start talking, and I'll stop it. Going further.
Europe, where he's talking about what the United States is and is not going to do. And it has a lot of people in Ukraine worried, but I think it's going to have a lot of people in the United States breathing a sigh of relief, because really for the first time in this whole war, from a senior American official, you're seeing something that is approximating, representing what's actually going on the ground. And we're going to break down some of the comments from Secretary Hegseth today by the inestimable Doug McGregor, Colonel McGregor, former highly decorated combat veteran, CEO of our country, our choice, and just all around great guy. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Sure, Dan. Happy to be here.
Well, listen, let's just get right into it. Some of the things that Secretary Hegseth said today were, I think, a welcome relief. Some of the comments, I mean, he's still saying some things that, I think you have to say to keep a public face. But I think when you both look at the very strident comments he said in a couple of places, along with reading between the lines, I think that we're starting to get an idea of maybe where President Trump is going, where what he hopes to negotiate it into this war. And we'll be real interested to see some of your thoughts on what you think is really going on the ground, or at least behind the scenes. Let's start with the first one here, because Secretary Hegseth says he thinks that finally we're starting to pay attention to the realities on the ground.
We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
I think that's a pretty stark rebuke of Zelensky, who's always talked about actually the 1991 borders. And now then Hegseth is saying you're not even going to get the 2014 borders. What do you make of that?
Well, Secretary Hegseth's comments are a breath of fresh air. They give us hope that we can actually reach some sort of final outcome in the region that could be good for us, good for the Russians, and good for the Europeans. And he's telling the truth. You know, we've struggled with this, as you know, you, I, and many others, for months and months and months. And the media has pushed back with just an inexhaustible source of lies about how well things are going for Ukraine, and the Russians are miserable and they're losing and they're committing atrocities. All of that was nonsense. So I think what he's saying.
Okay, I completely agree with what Doug says here. All of that was nonsense. The propaganda was awful. The lying to the American people, okay, was awful. Doug just lays it out straight and says what he thinks.
He's subtle, which he has to be, obviously, but he's making it clear the future is not going to look like the past, so you can hang up any expectations or hopes that we're going to commit to some long-term reversal of the gains in this war by the Russians.
Now, you've had Zelensky here in recent days trying to, I guess, entice President Trump by saying, look, I'm gonna make a deal with you. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of rare earths. And President Trump himself, in an interview with Bret Baier a couple of days ago, said, yeah, I want like $500 million worth of this stuff. But what neither one of them have actually said is what they think that they're going to get for that. I don't know if it's I think Trump is thinking it's going to be a repayment for all the money we've already given, but Zelensky seems to think he's going to get something out of it. What do you think is best you can read the tea leaves? Does Zelensky even think he's going to get from Trump by offering this so-called deal?
First of all, anything that Zelensky says deserves to be treated with serious skepticism. The rare earth deposits that we know of are in the Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. These areas are controlled by the Russians. They're historically Russian. They're Russian again, and that's not going to change. I don't know if anybody has briefed President Trump on that. So this is not a department store where you're unhappy with your purchase and you want to go back and get your money. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't see how we extract any price from anybody for the stupidity of what the Biden administration has undertaken. In fact, I hope President Trump is going to look into this massive sum of money that belonged to the Russians that we effectively confiscated with the goal of turning it over to Ukrainians, especially as it becomes increasingly clear how hundreds of billions of dollars and euros and so forth have disappeared into the black hole and ended up in Zelensky's bank account along with a number of his criminal buddies. So hopefully, President Trump will recognize that's not going to happen.
Now,
I think that was a very important point. Okay, the reason why is, from a Russian point of view, they have to be really sore that $300 billion worth of theirs that was in Western banks was simply confiscated, frozen, and basically confiscated. That was piracy in terms of international law. It had no business being a part of the conflict. I'm sure the Russians are going to say they want that money back. It was illegitimately seized in contradiction to international law. The Europeans, okay, and the West and the United States had no right, okay, any part of that. And they're going to ask for it back. And I hope, okay, along with Doug, that there's no nonsense about that, going forward, because that's going to be a sore point.
Now, one of the things that that Zelensky has been floating of late, and of course he's floated a lot of stuff, so I take it with a grain of salt, but he wants a ceasefire on somewhere along the current line of contacts. He wants up to 200,000 peacekeepers to patrol this, sort of like a Korea split kind of situation. And he's also talking about he wants some kind of security guarantees. Now, the Secretary Hegseth here talked about the security guarantees, but I think with a couple of pretty important caveats.
Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Okay, so I'm certainly happy to hear him categorically say there will be no American troops, anything involved with this. And he also said no NATO. What do you think of those two caveats?
Well, I think they're helpful. At this point, I don't know what Moscow is willing to accept. Moscow has been very resistant, and obviously anything with the NATO label on it. But I'm not really sure that Moscow wants to see any foreign troops at all on Ukrainian soil. Now, these are where the details become important. Are these non-NATO forces going to go in and quote unquote demilitarize Ukraine? In other words, are they going to remove any of the remaining equipment that poses a threat to Russia? Are they going to have a hand in policing the place to ensure that there are not underground cells being secretly supplied by MI6 or CIA to start another insurgency against Russia? I don't know. I mean, these are the kinds of things the Russians are going to ask. Again, I think this is a move in the right direction, but I don't think there's any interest in freezing anything along any lines of contact at this point. I think the Russians are going to take the position when you come back and you have a real proposal that is going to meet our needs, our security needs. We'll talk. That hasn't happened yet. No. And that doesn't mean this is not better than what we saw before. And it's hard to judge what Moscow will accept. But remember, the Russians have lost, 90,000 dead. I don't know the numbers of wounded, but fortunately, half of those or more have been returned to duty. And another 10,000 non-Russian army dead. In other words, people that are not part of this Russian army per se. That's a lot of people under any circumstances, far more than we lost in Vietnam. And the difference between Vietnam and what's happening in Ukraine is clear and unambiguous. The Russians have won. So they're not going to give much up unless they're absolutely certain of what this outcome looks like. So I think that's a huge improvement. The fact that there will be no Americans involved is nice. But again, I think the Russians would also like a larger security architecture. And that's something that President Trump should be very interested in, because he was always interested in reducing our profile overseas, particularly in Europe, also in Northeast Asia. And a new security architecture is the way to do that.
Danny, would you please take
Yep.
note of what Trump just put up on Truth Social just a few minutes ago here about a conversation he has had with President Putin.
That's interesting. I can't really read all that on the screen here, but hopefully he's saying this is something that's going to reduce any confusion on the battlefield. And one wonders, and who knows, whatever he's written here, I can only imagine that's going to be, for public release, and we don't know what was really discussed here. But let's just kind of, based on what you see on the ground and what you know of Russia, Doug, what would you expect that Putin? What is the message from Putin to Trump? And do you think, if this conversation took place as he said?
First and foremost, what President Putin will want are confidential discussions. He's not interested in, grabbing the stage for a big splash in the media that something great has happened and Donald Trump, have done it. If President Trump wants this to succeed, President Trump should go back to saying what I heard him say the other day. We're talking and we're making progress. Thank you. Next question. Stop talking about the details. Don't get into it. Hegseth did a good job thus far. Let's leave it there. And if we're going to send the envoy over, let that all happen behind closed doors and let nothing be leaked or shared until there is substantive agreement. You'll recall back in the 80s, people used to talk about, let's have a Gorbachev summit. It became a metaphor for the major heads of state showing up and agreeing to something after there had been long, exhausting negotiations to get an agreement. Well, I think that's where we need to go now. So I hope that whatever the president says, he's going to go back to what he said before. We're talking, we're making progress, Chris, thanks very much. That's the right answer. And what Hegseth has said is encouraging, but it's not an end state. The only end state really of great importance to us is that NATO has nothing to do with Ukraine and no American forces will be involved. That's good news. The rest of it, I think, is negotiable, and we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Okay, I think Doug is very correct about that. He understands that there's a lot of serious work that has to go on. And he thinks that because he has in mind, based on what the Russians have said in the past, and Putin has said on numerous occasions, Lavrov has said on numerous occasions, that what the Russians are interested in is an overall security framework with respect to themselves, okay, and Europe, okay, and the United States. And eventually they'd even, I think, like to go beyond that to a security framework that would involve themselves, okay, and the whole of Eurasia. But for the time being, a security framework that makes peace between themselves, okay, and the Europeans and the United States. That's what they're looking for, okay, as an outcome, okay, of this. And they believe strongly that there will be a settlement in Ukraine that will fall out of the general agreement. But they're not primarily looking for a settlement of Ukraine here and peace with Ukraine, okay, because they're an ace away from being able simply to dictate the terms of peace, okay, to Ukraine. So their interest is not in that, it's in solving the larger problem, the causes of this war, okay, in the first place, as they see it. Okay, we got a little buffering here.
Yeah, I was reading part of that as you were talking there, and basically the only thing he said about the end state was, well, I think we can get, quote, common sense outcome. And as long as we're both applying the same standard of what common sense is, then we have some possibilities here. And toward that end, I want to get back to Secretary Hegseth here, because he was saying that we're looking for a durable peace, but again, with an important caveat.
A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Okay, so it's good to that, but this is the one part of it that gives me a little bit of pause when he says that there must be security guarantees, and we don't want to Minsk 3.0. Now, on that last point there, you may find some common agreement with the Russian side, because they don't want a Minsk 3.0, because the Russians feel like that was the disaster. Hegseth is talking there almost like he thinks it's from the Western point that Minsk 1.0 and 2.0 were failures. What is your assessment of the whole Minsk analogy?
Well, before we go to the Minsk business, let's keep in mind that everything that Secretary Hegseth has said has been said by the Russians for months. He's simply repeating back to the Russians what they've said. So that's fine. I happen to have agreed with that from the very beginning. When it comes to security guarantees, depends on how you interpret that. This is back to the idea of a larger security architecture, which is designed to prevent any further outbreak in the future. So I think we're getting closer and closer and closer to the point where the Russians will talk to us, because we're effectively repeating back to them what they've been saying for months, and they were always ignored by Biden. Now, as far as Minsk goes, remember that Minsk, as we now know, and Macron has said this as well, not just Mrs. Merkel, who was in the chancellorship at the time in Germany, was designed to buy time for this Ukrainian reactionary criminal state to build up an army and a force with which it could attack Russia. Now, that's what we mean when we don't want another Minsk round, because it was meaningless. There was no intention on the part of the West to ever implement anything. And the sad part is that ultimately, between 2014 and the outbreak or the beginning of this intervention by the Russians in 2022, more than 14,000 Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk were killed by the incessant attacks by the Ukrainians. So I think, that's what we need to understand about Minsk. Minsk was a fraud, and it was perpetrated to confuse and mislead and beguile the Russians. So when he says no more Minsk, I think he's sending a signal, as is Donald Trump, we're not going to go down that road. I hope so, because one of the things that we've got to be certain of is that we tell the truth. You can lie in a domestic context, as most politicians do, about a lot of things. In international relations between great powers, you have to be absolutely truthful.
That point, is a very important one. Because one lesson which the Russians, the Chinese, the Arabs, other people in the world as well, have learned from relating to the United States over the years is that we rarely keep our agreements. We make them, and then we feel free to break them. To other people, it looks like when we're negotiating with them, that we're lying to them. In order to have a successful system, of international relations, where the wars are few and far between, the diplomats, the representatives of the various nations, have to tell each other the truth about facts on the ground as they see facts on the ground. They have to tell each other the truth about their intentions. When people begin to lie to each other, that is a big source of conflict. And that is a big cause for large-scale wars to break out in the areas where the different countries are in conflict with each other in the border areas between the great powers. We've talked often here about a multipolar world, and this being a new situation. I've pointed out in the past that a multipolar world is one where there are a number of great powers. In between the great powers are small powers. And usually the areas of conflict are on the turf of the smaller powers, and the great powers are jockeying for position and competing with each other in those particular areas. That's the way of things, okay, in a multipolar world. And if you're going to have a multipolar world which is peaceful, then the conflicts between the great powers, okay, in that world have to be negotiated in a collaborative manner so wars do not break out. And for that to happen, the nations and the diplomats have to be honest with each other. They have to tell the truth. They have to trust each other, that when one side says something, it's what they really think and what they really feel. And that they're not being deceptive when they bargain with them. So deception has to come out of the bargaining process. And the United States in recent years, and the European powers in recent years, when they bargain with the East, with the Russians, with other people in West Asia, for a long time have not been honest and cannot be trusted. And Doug is saying that trust has to be rebuilt again. And for trust to arise out of the situation, it's necessary for people to be truthful once again. Going on.
And on that regard, and especially talking about the Minsk and where this is going, I think we have to take a second to look at the hand, the negotiating hand, the leverage that Trump does and doesn't have in terms of what kind of an outcome he's going to get. And I think that, and I'd like your view on this, I think that history is going to be really ugly to the Biden administration, and really to the West writ large. And that includes virtually all of NATO heading back into the time before the invasion happened, going back into 2021, because obviously we had the Minsk agreements. At any time we could have compelled Ukraine to just abide by the terms that we helped negotiate, and there would never, almost certainly, have never been a war. But then we systematically sabotaged every opportunity to either prevent the war right before it happened, or any of a number of negotiating possibilities. We kept on sabotaging those, and we had Secretary of Defense Austin, who said, early in the war, that our objective was to, quote, weaken Russia. Well, now then, the cost for that effort is probably, and I think you've said it a couple of times, and the evidence, I think, supports it, somewhere close to 1 million Ukrainian deaths so far. Certainly the loss of a lot of territory, and yet we have a Russia that's not only not weakened, but now it's a lot stronger than it was. I wonder if you can talk about a little bit about how much stronger Russia is, because I think some still don't understand that.
Well, this is important to understand that whenever I've been critical of President Trump on the question of what to do about Ukraine since he took office, I fully support the president on his domestic policies, and I think they're going in the right direction. He set a lot of positive forces in motion. Strongly support those. My concern has always been not to be distracted by events overseas. That if he is, he could lose control here at home because there are far more serious crises that are closer to us. And that's where he should focus. Now, having said that,
Okay, of course, I do not agree with Doug about the domestic arena and the moves that Trump has made in the domestic arena. I believe they're clearly unlawful, okay, and unconstitutional, and they're very damaging when it comes to the area of internal conflict here, okay, in the United States. They're very damaging to our future. I have to add that I think that very many people who primarily focus, okay, on international politics and the need for peace in international politics and the need to avoid a nuclear war, okay, in national politics, find themselves not very concerned about what Trump is doing in the area of domestic politics, because I think they just don't think domestic politics is quite as important, and they are not perhaps as attuned to the the niceties of domestic law and the Constitution and the importance of those for the continued existence of the United States. So here's an area where I think I disagree with Doug quite substantially.
Okay, I'll see you over on my show.
Okay, I will be there in a few minutes, Dee, and thank you for being here for this
Yes.
period. I will see
You're
you soon over there. I won't be late. Okay, I'll play just a little more of this, and then I will have to go over and join Dee.
I think we have to understand a couple of things. He came in and he adopted this false narrative that had been spun up over the previous years in London and Langley, and then repeated ad nauseum by the media, that we're all willing servants of this war. He's got to sweep that aside. He's got to get back to basics and go back to something that he did indicate a long time ago. This is not his. He did not start this. He did not want this. He said repeatedly it wouldn't have happened had he been there, fine. But now he needs to make it very clear this is not his, and he wants to end it. Now, he doesn't have to get a quote-unquote win over the Russians. Believe me, if he ends this, he gets a win at home, here, with the American people. They don't want anything to do with this war with Russia, and certainly don't want the risk of any kind of nuclear conflagration. Absolutely not. So that's his win. The Europeans win because they're ultimately going to replace these terrible governments, these globalists that have sacrificed over 1 million Ukrainian lives and hundreds of thousands of Russians to nothing, for no purpose, when it was completely necessary. They need to go away, and they need to be expelled and removed. Now, as far as whether or not NATO survives, I don't think it will. I think NATO is increasingly an empty facade, and it may be one of these things, well, it ended with a whimper, not a bang. It may just quietly sink into the abyss and vanish. It's not meaningful. And frankly, at this point, from an American standpoint, that's fine. The United States doesn't need it. What we need is good relations with everybody in Europe, and we don't need to have to garrison the place to get those. So I think all of this is bound up with what President Trump is thinking, and I'm really glad to hear the things that Secretary Hegseth has said, because they are a breath of fresh air.
Okay, so that's all I'll have time for tonight of this video. I think Doug's stated views in the video are very, very important, and therefore, when I come back on Saturday night for my Saturday night show, which is a longer show, I'm going to continue the analysis and the commentary on this video. So I'll now look at your comments. Stop sharing this, and I'll look at your comments. And then I will say goodnight for tonight. Okay, and go over. And Robert says he likes to hear both sides of an issue. Well, usually there are many sides of an issue. I think one often has to get that by looking at, many videos. But I don't think it's necessarily an obligation of someone, to present all sides of an issue. Robert says there are three sides of the issue, which are your side, their side, and then there is the truth. Yes, but of course we cannot know what the truth is completely. We can try to get as close to the truth as we can, but we cannot know, we cannot prove that we've gotten there. Does Douglas McGregor has any proof of his accusations? Yes, he does. Which nations will send in peacekeeping forces? There are not going to be any nations who are going to send in peacekeeping forces, because I don't expect that the Russians will accept any peacekeeping forces. They'll impose terms on Ukraine that they want to impose on Ukraine. And they'll rely on those terms to keep the peace with respect to Ukraine. There won't be any need for peacekeeping forces in a broader security framework. That security framework will be secured by treaties. We'll have to see some treaties. Robert says common sense when Trump and Putin talking is a bleeping joke. Well, that's your view. I would tend to agree that Trump is lacking in common sense, but I think Putin has a surfeit of it. So on that note, I'm going to say goodnight and thank you all for coming. I'm going to go and join Dee, who should just be starting her show. And I invite you all to join me at Around the World with Dee and Friends, where we'll be continuing to talk over some extremely important issues. So again, thank you for coming. I'm going to end the stream now.